Hey.
Dag Lisa en Lise en iedereen die aan het meevolgen is, want iedereen kan ons al zien en horen. We gaan nog even wachten voor we starten, hè, maar goed dat je er bent en dat iedereen aan het binnenkomen is. En dan kunnen we er, denk ik, over een klein 10 minuutjes aan beginnen. Hè.
Alright.
Hoi, dag Simon.
Hi, dag Stijn, hallo.
Dag Lisa.
Hallo.
Dit lijkt goed te werken. Ik stel voor dat we nog even wachten tot 2 uur voor de start. Intussen kan iedereen ons al horen en zien, dus dan weten jullie dat ook. Maar om 2 uur stel ik voor dat we terug de webcams aanzetten en de klank openzetten en dan beginnen we eraan.
Wat zie je eigenlijk als we de webcam niet aanzetten?
Dan zien de mensen niks eigenlijk voorlopig. Nee, dan zien ze gewoon een zwart scherm.
Oké, ja.
Tot zometeen dan.
Straks.
Joep.
Ah ja, ze zien die afbeelding. Goed.
Dag Sebastien is daar ook precies.
Ah ja, ja.
Ja, hey.
Hey.
Nou.
Maar ik zie jullie niet, of wel? Nee.
Nee, maar het is...
je micro uit.
Ah ja. We moeten stil zijn.
Ik ga toch nog een keer proberen mijn scherm te delen. Ah ja, of nee, dat gebeurt maar als je me presenter maakt. Oké, ja. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. My name is Stijn Dubai. I work for Designregio Kortrijk, and I will shortly introduce this workshop on pricing for creative industries. This afternoon, we're hosting a webinar on pricing, and it's part actually of the Designer Club. Designer Club is actually an initiative of the TRIPOD project. TRIPOD stands for Transregional Project for Innovation and Promotion of Design, and it's funded by the Interreg program Flanders, Wallonia, and France. The project itself is operated by 10 partners from the north of France, Wallonia, and Flanders, and Designregio Kortrijk, who is organizing this webinar together with Flanders DC, is part of that project. The project of TRIPOD consists actually of 3 actions. Firstly, we help companies in integrating design thinking. Secondly, we organize trainings in design management. And the third action is creating a network of designers and entrepreneurs that so they can collaborate in a cross-border setting. The Designer Club that we are organizing today is part of this third action. Normally, we do it live within a venue in the north of France or Wallonia or Flanders. But of course, now it's online, and we're very sorry we can't offer you a drink afterwards, but let's keep that for the next edition. Before we go to start the webinar, I just want to share with you some trainings that are being organized by this TRIPOD project. The one is on how to maintain and develop your business with digital tools. There's a training on circular building and architecture, and there's also an introduction training on design thinking. You can find all the trainings on www.tripoddesign.eu, or you can contact my colleague Anne-Sophie Prévost at Design Innovation for more information. We will share these contacts and these with you later in the email that will follow after this workshop. I would now like to give the floor to Simon of Flanders DC, who will give you the webinar. And let me just make him the presenter of the workshop. Ah, he's already there.
You should be able to hear me now, but yes, indeed, you're making me presenter, which is perfect. I will start sharing my screen in a second. There you go. I hope that's working, and I also hope you are able to see me by now. I think, yes, you can see my screen too, right? Anyone who is able to mention something in the chat can do that, and then I will, yes, okay, I can read everybody is hearing me now. Okay, perfect. I will also hide myself because I don't like watching myself during the whole webinar, and then I will get started. Thank you everybody for this opportunity. Thank you for joining, because I really like talking about pricing, and I hope I will be able to make this an interesting webinar. So be sure to ask your questions if you have some during the webinar. I read all the questions that you sent beforehand while opting in for this webinar. So I read those, but if you have other questions, you can mention them in the questions field in the GoToWebinar software, then we can have a look, of course. So as I said, I really like to talk about pricing. It's something I talk about a lot. Why do I like that? Because it's just a really interesting topic. It's it's really subjective. If you would talk to someone about an object, a creative object, for example, and you would ask 2 people what they think the right price would be. One person may say something like €100, and the other person might say something a tenfold amount that he might think it's worth €1,000. So it's really interesting. In that way, pricing is very subjective. We have very different opinions. But still, there also exist very objective ways to determine a good price, which is interesting, which is something we're going to talk about today. We're going to try to hand you some methods how to do pricing in a good way. So that's an interesting difference. It's subjective, but also very objective. So that's one of the things I like about pricing. What I'm not going to tell you is the right price, because some people might be hoping for that. I'm afraid I'm gonna have to disappoint you then. I also read it in some of the questions you sent. People were, for example, asking what's the right price point for an interior architect. Sorry, I can't tell that because there are so much differences. It's not a good idea to talk about one right price. We have a lot of variables that you have to take into account, and we're going to talk about those variables. We're going to talk about the ways how to determine a good price for your business, and that's what I hope to learn to you today. But I'm not going to tell you the right prices. I'm not going to mention a lot of numbers neither, because as I said, I don't believe that's the right way to look at pricing. So what I'm going to do is try to give you some inspiration, how to make some choices while doing your pricing exercise. And also I'm going to try to give you some ideas how to communicate about your prices, which is also very important, maybe even more important than the prices themselves. Of course, I will also be mentioning COVID-19, the corona crisis we are all dealing with today. It has a huge impact on everything we do, also on your business and also on your pricing. But I will be keeping that part more for the end of the webinar. It impacts everything, but I have some specific thoughts about how corona may influence your prices, and I'll give some ideas on that more towards the end of the webinar. So that will be mentioned too. Before we really dive into the content of the webinar, I wanted to talk just a little bit about who I am, and more importantly, where I come from, which organization I stand for. I'm from Flanders DC. That stands for Flanders District of Creativity, which is a Flemish organization. I understand some of you are from France. We're from the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, and we try to help support, promote, and connect entrepreneurs in the Flemish creative industries. So we're an organization that does that since a long time. We have this is our mission that you can read here. We do a lot of types of activities. If you might wonder which are those creative industries, we have enlisted them in 12 sub-industries that you can read here. And as it happens, most of you, almost all of you, are active in one of these 12 industries. So that's a good match, which is perfect. And I know you're working in those industries because that's a question we asked when in the registration form. As you can see here, this is interesting. Also, just to know who else is participating in this webinar. I notice I wrote the title in Dutch, but as you can imagine, that says sectoren, that means industries. So the different industries we have present here today are enlisted here. Most of you are designers, which is not a surprise, as the organizing people are from Kortrijk Design Regio, but also we have a lot of other creative industries present, which is very nice. I also mentioned here the age of the participants. Just so you know, we have people of all ages, which is really, really nice. It's a good idea to work on your pricing at any age, so that's a good idea. About Flanders DC, I don't have much more to say because that's not the topic of the webinar, but our baseline is return on creativity. So that's actually our most important goal. We try to help on the business aspects of being an entrepreneur in the creative industries. So we help in business aspects. We're not going to tell you how to be creative or how you should think of new ideas. We're actually really helping you with the business aspects, and that also means pricing, of course. If you want to know more, we have a website. It's we have a Dutch version, but also an English version, so you can check it out there. There's a lot of information and inspiration, so have a look, and then you'll get to know us better. What I also can tell is that I also have another background. So I work for Flanders DC as an advisor. I give a lot of advice to people working in those creative industries. But I also have another profession. Together with some of my best friends, I launched a handkerchief brand a few years ago. So we make beautiful handkerchiefs, which are also ecological and sustainable and made in an honest way in Europe, in Belgium. And I like to mention this because it's relevant. I think that I also have experience in the field. We sell these handkerchiefs via a web shop and also via more than 40 shops by now. So I am experienced in talking to shops on how to price our items, which terms and conditions we should use in wholesale circumstances. So that's good to know. I also have some experience there. Okay, enough about me, I think. I would like to dive in, and I also always like to dive in with an example. And this is the example I would like to start with, and it's about this woman. Her name is Paula Scher, and she's a graphic designer, and she made a famous logo. It's already 20 years ago that she did it. It's the logo for Citibank. Actually, 20 years ago, when there was a huge merger between Citibank and another financial group called Travelers at that time. And they were going to merge as two groups, and there was a need for a new logo. And Paula, the lady you can see on the screen, was actually the woman they asked to design the new logo. And as the story goes, there was an interesting meeting at the beginning of the process for that new logo, because it was actually the first meeting they had, and they were explaining to Paula which values they would stand for as the new financial group. They were talking about some ideas. And actually, after 5 minutes, it wasn't more than that, as the story goes, Paula scribbled something on a napkin. And that napkin, you can see a picture of it here. And she said, "I think this will be your logo," which was amazing, because actually, as the process went further, it really appeared to be the logo they were going to choose, and it was still, it became this logo that still is used by the whole Citi group, the Citibank group. So that's amazing. She only took 5 minutes to come up with this idea, and she wrote it on a napkin, and she already had the final idea, which was astonishing. Very, very nice job by Paula. Now, I always like to ask a question, and we can try to do that even though it's a webinar. You have a questions field in the GoToWebinar software. I would like to ask you, everybody who is listening, to give me a guess what the price would have been for this logo. So if you know she only took 5 minutes to get the idea, I would like you to write down in the questions field what you think the price was for this logo. So I'm just going to wait a few seconds for some reactions, and I already see somebody with a pretty good guess, actually. But I'm not going to say it yet. I want to wait for some more reactions. But I see them coming. I see a lot of reactions, which is great. Okay. I can read here 1,500 euros, 1,000 euros, 30,000 euros, 50 euros, $50,000, 500, a few thousand euro, 45,000, I think. No, 50,000 is the highest guess until now, which is nice. No, okay, Kurt, he dares to say 200,000, which is really nice. Okay, I have an idea. Okay. We have a very broad range from 50 euro until 200,000 euro, which is amazing as such already, because you can see in this simple question how subjective pricing is, and we really notice there's a lot of difference. Elias is the best guesser until now. Elias wrote $1 million. He's the best guesser because you might be very amazed, but the correct answer is the price that has been billed for this logo was $1.5 million. So that's an amazing amount, of course. It's a very high price, you might say, for something that you imagined in just a few minutes. But why am I giving you this example? I want to talk about it because it's not as crazy as you might think it is. I don't want to push you to choose prices in this range. I know it's very exceptional to be able to price your products or your services that high. But I want to give you an idea by talking about this example, which is that idea price. Well, actually, it's not me telling this, it's Paula who told it. She gave a TED talk about it, and she said the price we asked, $1.5 million, wasn't that crazy as you might think, for 3 reasons. First, it only took me 5 minutes to think of the logo, she said. Only 5 minutes. But those 5 minutes, after those 5 minutes, it wasn't done, the work. Of course, they had to refine it, they had to make more sketches and more detailed logos, and they had to present it, and a whole long process followed it. So, of course, the work wasn't done. You can imagine, certainly for a bank, that would take a long time. But still, she said, okay, that's not the only reason why the 1.5 million was okay. Second reason is, she said, okay, I got the idea in just a few seconds, but I worked a few seconds after a career of 34 years. So I worked 34 years and I watched hundreds of movies. I read so much books. I had so much experience. All that time I invested to get to this point, to get this knowledge that I have, is also worth something. It should also be paid for. So those few seconds aren't the only part that need to be paid. I also want my experience to be paid and all my knowledge to be paid, which is correct, which is also a good reason to ask more than a few euros, although it only costs her a few minutes. And the third reason, which is probably the most important to me, the third reason why she said, okay, the logo, it should have cost that, it's okay that it cost that much, is because it's perfectly okay not to just account your hours and the time you invest in your work to determine a price. And that is something, a mind switch that a lot of people still have to make. You don't only have to compensate for the time you invest when you're determining a price. You also can take into account the value that you create for your client. That's something we're going to talk about a few times today, and it's also a very well-known concept in the pricing field and also in business lessons. It's called value-based pricing, and that's something that is very relevant and very interesting for all of you, I think, as you're all active in the creative industries. It's perfectly okay to take into account the value you create for your clients. And when you're working for a large financial group like Citibank, of course, you're creating a whole lot of value. Citibank has been using the new logo for 20 years now because they're still using it in the whole world, and it's been mentioned on thousands of buildings, on millions of papers. So this logo has been used very, very much. Of course, it needs to be valued enough, the work she delivered, and also the value she has created for her client, in this case, Citibank. So that's something, if you remember only one thing of this whole webinar, because I'm not, I don't make any illusions. I know people don't remember a lot after courses like this, certainly after a few months, but in a few months, if people ask you, what did you learn from that webinar? I hope it is that you don't only have to compensate your time when you're determining a price, but you also can compensate for the value you create for your customers. Okay. That as a first example, I always like to add another example of a logo. So the logo of Citibank cost $1.5 million. Maybe you could also give me a guess how much this logo costed, which is even more well known, I think. It's the logo of Nike. It's not a higher amount. It's only $35 actually. It's which is a very low amount. Apparently, it has been designed by a student a few decades ago. That was one of the co-students of the founders of Nike. She only got $35 to design this famous swoosh logo, but good to know afterwards when Nike became a very big brand, they also compensated her with some stocks of Nike, and those are worth around $1 million today. So okay, she got her fair compensation, I think. Just as a small story to tell with that. Okay, I wanted you to remember that value is an important aspect of pricing. If you also remember a second thing, maybe, or if you take something out of this webinar, I also would like it to be that you don't have to be nervous when you're talking about your price. That's also something people tend to do. It's something people don't like to talk about, how much they cost, how much their work costs. But that's absolutely, there's no reason for that. I always like to make the comparison to someone who works in a coffee bar. If you sell coffee and people come up and they ask you one coffee, you're not nervous when you say, okay, the coffee costs €2 or €3. You're not nervous. Why is that? Why is it that those people are not nervous when they when they have to tell the price of their product? And that you, maybe as a designer or an architect or whatever, when you have to talk about your price, you're a bit shaky. You don't like to tell the price. There's no reason for that. And to me, I think a way to become the same in the same state of mind as a coffee bar worker is by knowing that the price, the difference is the coffee bar worker, he knows that his price has been tested, has been validated. He knows that people who know what they were doing did good research to determine this price. So they're sure it's an okay price, and therefore they don't have any hesitations when they talk about the price. You could be in the same position if you also do your homework, if you also know how to determine a price, and if you also know my price is validated, it works. So I have no reason whatsoever to be nervous when I tell it to my potential clients. So that's something we are going to strive for, something I hope to give you some ideas how to determine your price, so you also can tell your prices in a very confident way without any hesitations. Okay, how about the structure of this presentation and of my story? I will be talking first about 3 questions that you can see on the screen now. What do you offer? For who do you offer it? And which revenue model do you choose? Those are actually like 3 ingredients that you need to have before you can even start pricing. So I will talk about all 3 of these in the first half of the webinar because they're very important. I will also give you some ideas and inspiration on how to choose a revenue model, for example. If we know the answer to these 3 questions, we can pass on to the next step. And those are the 3 methods for pricing, 3 pricing methods. First one is cost-based, second one is market-based, and the third one is value-based. We already talked a bit about the third one. Those are 3 important ways to determine a good price for your work. They're all 3 important. We always advise to use all 3 of those methods, and then afterwards, when you did the 3 exercises, then you can choose a correct price or good price for your own situation. And if you have those 3 prices, you're going to have sort of a scope of the price that would be correct. Not correct, but good for your work. It could look something like this, or the cost-based maybe lower than the value-based. So the order isn't important, but it looks like a scale, and that's actually the result, and those are the results that you can start working with to determine a good price for you. But I will talk about this more when we get to that point in the webinar. If we translate this to sort of a structure for the webinar, it would look something like this. So first we're talking about what you're going to do and for whom. Then we're going to talk about revenue models. Then we're going to talk about the pricing methods. And finally, in the end, we will talk about the questions you still have. You can send those questions already now during the webinar, but we also have some questions, and those I will be talked about first that you sent beforehand. So I have some final ideas and tips, and also communication advice on how to communicate about your prices. Okay. Finally, it's time to dive really into the content of the webinar, and that will be firstly about what you do and for whom you do it. So these are two of the three ingredients you really need to even start on your pricing. And actually, it's a bit business school 101, you might say, because it's something you all should know already, what you're going to do or what you already are doing as a creative entrepreneur, and for whom you're working also should be very clear. But still, I notice many people neglect the importance of these questions. People don't really think about them. They think it's so obvious that they don't have to put it into words, but I would really want to suggest that you do put it into words and that you give it some extra thought. What you do, you could also describe this as your offer or your value proposition, which is some business lingo word, but your value proposition, the way you create value for your customers, is a really important question. So which products or services do you offer? And also, how is it different compared to others? And the second question is, for who do you do it? Which are your customer segments? In another way, so which profile do your customers have? Which customers do you want to reach? Maybe you don't reach them yet, but which do you want to reach? Those are two very important questions. The first one, what do you offer? So I can imagine you're perfectly able to describe it. I hope so. Maybe you could say, I'm a designer. Okay, that's good. But I want you to think about it more in deep. So what do you design? What style do you design? Is it maybe a very popular design? Do you make things that everybody thinks is okay? Or do you make really niche designs? Do you make very specific designs that maybe not everybody likes, but the people who like it, they like it a lot? Do you have a certain style? Maybe do you have specific skills? If you're a designer, okay, you know how to work in, I don't know, Illustrator, Photoshop, stuff like that. But maybe you also know how to animate, and you can make animated GIFs, or you can make animation videos. Okay, do you have specific extra skills? You want to know that, and you want to be able to pinpoint all those parts of your offer, so you know how it differentiates, and that's the key word, how it differentiates from others. When you're doing a pricing exercise, the differentiating elements of your offer are so important, because if you're not able to mention some differentiating aspects, then you can also not differentiate in your price. If you do something that a whole lot of people do, a whole lot of other entrepreneurs do it exactly the same, then you probably have to use the same prices as the others, and probably on the lower end of the price range, because you do something that everybody else already does, so you'll have a lot of competition. If you're in that case, it could be okay, but you should be aware that it's very difficult to raise your prices then. But if you can think about this question and you have some answers that really are differentiating, if you really know that you have certain skills, a specific style, if you have any other differentiating aspects that you really know that they are innovative, that there are not a lot of competitors that also have those skills, or not in the area, not in the same industries, for example, you're very good in a specific industry style. Okay, if you have that, then you are able to make some differentiating choices, and also in your pricing. So it could be possible then to ask a higher price because you have some differentiating knowledge or skills. So that's something you should really be able to think about. If you would want an example, I always use the example of a copywriter. Let's suppose you're a customer and you're looking for a copywriter, and you want a copywriter to write a manual. one copywriter A could say, okay, no problem, I'm a copywriter and I write all types of texts. I love everything that's writing. So I could write an article, I could write a magazine, I could write marketing text, I could write a manual. Okay, give it to me. Or you have copywriter B that says, oh, this is a really good job for me because actually I only write manuals. It's my specific focus. I am highly skilled in writing manuals. And also, by the way, I have my own layout software, so I can even put it in a proper layout, so you can send my work directly to the printer, and it will be perfect because I'm very experienced in manuals. Of course, as a customer, you will be tending to choose the second copywriter because he's so experienced, he has specific skills, he can help you, and you will probably also be it will probably also be okay for you to pay more for the second one than for the first one, because you know the result will probably also be better because of his experience and his skills. So that's the idea I want to plant. Think about some differentiating specific aspects of your offer and try to put them into words. That's what I wanted to say about your offer and about your value proposition. The second part of this question I wanted to talk about is, who are your customers? Also, this could be a bit of an obvious question. You probably know who you're working for, but also here I would like to make it, I would like you to make it specific enough. Let's say if you are a marketing agency or a marketing freelancer, who are your customers? Is it anybody? Is it B2C, just people who also want wedding invitations, or are you specifically working for companies? Okay, but which type of companies? Are it small and medium-sized enterprises, or are it really big multinational corporates? Maybe are it cafes and restaurants that you work for mostly? Try to really pinpoint which types of customers you're working for. And it is always a good idea to make some choices there, because you might think anybody who wants to become my customer is welcome, so it doesn't really matter as long as they pay the bills. I understand that idea, but it's probably, often it is, it will pay off more if you do make some choices, because people will know that you're working specifically for them. So this sentence, the target audience is males and females aged 0 and up, is not always a good idea. There are very good examples of companies that make some choices, make some specific choices. And by making those choices, they are more successful. I have a really nice example of a Flemish small shop in Putten, which is a really small town in Belgium. And this is a picture of the shop. It's called Lefty Guitars, and the owner of this shop made a very interesting choice. So he had a guitar shop since a very long time. He was selling all kinds of guitars, but once in a while he had some customers that said, "Can I also try a left-handed guitar?" That was always a bit difficult, a difficult situation, because he always had to say, well, actually, no, I only have one left-handed guitar. It's in the back. I can go get it. But you can order all the other guitars in a left-handed version, but I don't have them in the shop, so you can try them. Okay, all those customers which were left-handed were disappointed, and he had to send them away. One day he made a choice. He said, okay, I'm going to do something for those most annoying customers. All those left-handed guitar players, they can come to me from starting from now, and I will sell only left-handed guitars. Or maybe he also sells the right-handed ones, but he says, in my shop, I only have the left-handed guitars. So if you want a left-handed guitar, come to my shop. I will have all guitars in a left-handed version. From that moment, Patrick, the owner of the shop, did better business than before, because the interesting thing was, by making that choice, all the left-handed people in the world, no, all the left-handed people in the large region, and if, I'm talking about Belgium, but also sometimes people from France, people from Holland, also coming to this really small shop in Putten because they want to try a left-handed guitar, and they know that he has the ultimate choice in left-handed guitars. He's doing better business now by narrowing down his customer segments, his focus, to almost 10% of the population, which is something you might not expect, but it's a very good example of how making good choices, how narrowing down your customer segments can really pay off in a business, in your business. This is an idea. This is something that also could work in any other industry. So I would advise you to think about it. Maybe also you could narrow down the people you want to work for, and then you could be making something much more relevant for them than when you didn't narrow it down. Okay, I was just having a glance at the questions, but I don't see any very big questions until now. If we are talking about describing your customers, who you're going to work for, this is an idea how to do that, because sometimes it's a bit difficult. How do you describe those customers? I always advise to describe the actions of those people, which is their behavior. And you could do this certainly if you're working for consumers. You could do this by making some sort of a persona of your customers. A persona is sort of a fictitious person that you imagine. So you can pick a picture from the internet. It doesn't even have to be a real person you know, and you could describe that person, for example, which age would she have or he have, what are his goals or what are the frustrations of that customer, maybe what are other brands. That's always very interesting to think about. What are other brands or shops or things that this person would also like, to make it really specific which type of customer you're looking at. So that could be a good idea if you want to describe who you're working for or who you want to work for. Something else I always like to say when talking about a value proposition and how to determine which your value proposition could be is this. I suppose that most of you know the abbreviation on the left. So USP stands for unique selling proposition. Most people know this. In a USP, you describe something that you do uniquely that makes it interesting, that helps you sell your work. It's a good idea to think about those unique selling propositions. A lot of you probably already did that, but I want to suggest that you should make a shift and not start thinking about your unique selling propositions, but you should start thinking about the unique buying reasons, which is just, in a way, it's a bit the same, but it's looking at the same thing from a different angle. When you're looking for your unique buying reasons, you're looking at it from the angle of the customer. And the unique buying reasons is also actually something that you can think of yourself. You should really ask it from your customers. What is a buying reason for you? What are you looking for when you're looking for something I would make for you? When you're looking for a logo, what are the buying reasons that you think are very important? Why would you buy it? And taking that perspective of the customer is really, really good advice. So I would also always advise you to look at this from the eyes of the customer and talk to your customers about it, because you will learn a lot. If we round up this part of the presentation, I would like to give you some homework. I won't be checking it, so you don't have to send it to me afterwards, but you can send it, obviously. But I would like to advise you, if you want to make work of this idea of describing your value proposition, this is an easy sentence that you could use to describe your value proposition. So to describe what you do and for who you do it, in other words. And it goes a bit like this. You could make a sentence for your own that says, I or we, I help, and then you describe your customers. Which types of customers are you servicing with? And then you describe the need. What need or problem do they have? By, and then you describe what your offer is. What do you do for them? And this differs from, and then you try to describe your competitors or what competitors do, or maybe which alternatives exist in the market, because and then you describe the differentiating elements. As I said in the beginning, this is really important that you have good differentiating elements. If you have good elements there, you're able to ask a higher price than if you don't have them. We will be sharing the presentation after the webinar, so if you don't have time to copy all text on the slides, that's no problem. You will get the presentation later. But I would advise you to make this exercise, and as you might have thought of yourself, actually, this sentence is also a good elevator pitch. So if you succeed in completing this sentence in a good way with the right words, and that's something I really want to emphasize. It's also about choosing the right words, how to describe all these things. If you succeed in that, you really have a good elevator pitch. These are some more tips about the value proposition. So as I said, dare to make choices. Don't try to please everyone. Be very specific when determining your customers. Don't try to service everyone, as I was saying. Don't focus on features. I didn't mention that before, but it's interesting when you describe how you make a difference or what your offer is. It's more interesting to focus on the values. And the example of the iPod, the first iPod launched by Apple, is very easy to understand. When they launched their iPod, they weren't talking about, okay, we're making an iPod of 10 gigabyte or 8 gigabyte, I don't know. They said, this is a device which can keep 10,000 songs for you. So they talked about the value they created, not about the features, the specific technical details. You could copy this idea to any industry. Like if you're a web developer, you don't have. It could be interesting to say that you work in Drupal, which is technology, website technology. It could be interesting to mention that, but if you want to tell it in a really compelling, attractive way, I would rather say, okay, we make it we make the websites, we design them, and we are able to develop the websites by the same person as the designer, because our technology makes that possible. You probably get the idea by now. I would say try to describe your value, not describe the features you're using. And also when you fabricate this story, this value proposition, keep on testing it, keep on changing it until it really works and until you really make it your own and you're able to tell it in a very attractive way.
Simon.
Yeah.
Excuse me for interrupting, but the sound for the moment is not that good. There's a
Okay.
And we checked with some colleagues. Maybe we can do a test.
I hope it won't take too long. I could change my microphone. Is it still bad?
Yes.
Okay, I will change my.
Okay, is this better? I chose another microphone.
Yes, way better. Thank you.
Is it way better? Okay, great. Then I don't need to use my
perfect.
headset.
Thank you.
So that's
Sorry for interrupting.
Right. No problem. If there are any questions, you can also interrupt me, of course. Okay, so I was almost done, I think, with these tips about the value proposition. So we can move on to the next part of the presentation, and that are the revenue models. So don't know if everyone knows what we mean with this. Revenue model is actually another way of describing how you ask money. How do your customers pay? And there are a lot of options. Do they pay per hour? Do they pay per day? Do they pay per word? As a copywriter, that might be the way you work. Or do they pay per product, which is also when you make products, very often chosen revenue model. Maybe you use a fixed rate or a percentage. Some people work with royalties in the creative industries. So there are a lot of options. You have endless possibilities. And I want to talk about a few, because what I want to do actually in this part of the presentation is inspire you with some ideas, maybe how to do it different.
often people tend to choose the same revenue model as all the other competitors choose. Sometimes that's a good idea. Sometimes you have to, because the customers wouldn't allow you to work in a different way. But sometimes it is interesting to think about different options, to do it differently than others. And it could be a way to stand out. It could be a way to make the difference with your competitors. It also could be more interesting. It could be more. It could make you more money if you choose another revenue model, or it could be just more convenient for you or for your customers. So I really believe this is an interesting thing to think about. And anyway, it's really it's something you need to know before you could even start doing a pricing exercise. So if we talk about revenue models, I will be showing you a whole lot of them, and maybe here and there I will be able to give some tips. A very well-known revenue model is per hour, is a rate per hour. A lot of freelancers use this, but also in other industries, it's something a lot of people work with. It could be interesting, but it isn't always interesting. It does have some disadvantages. One disadvantage is people like predictable cost. They like to, when you're a customer and you don't know beforehand how much it will be costing in the end, people don't really like that. Okay, you could give an estimate at the beginning, but still, it's sometimes not that attractive for a customer that they don't know beforehand what the price in the end will be. Also, what is a disadvantage? The price per hour is very comparable. When you say my price per hour is 55 euros and somebody else says it's 50 euros per hour, the customer might think, oh, the one with 50 euros per hour is cheaper. But that's absolutely not necessarily true, because the person who works at 55 per hour might work much faster than the one working at 50 per hour. So there's a lot of difference there, but for people it still is very comparable. So that's really a big disadvantage of working with the price per hour. Also, when you're pricing per hour, customers tend to start talking about the time you need for the work. So like they're going to say, okay, you charge 6 hours for that part of the job. Does it really take 6 hours? Can't you do it in 4 hours? That's not a nice discussion. You don't want to be talking about those aspects. That's your job. So you're the creator. You can estimate yourself how much time something costs, and if you give that much insight into your work by saying, okay, that will cost me 6 hours, etc., you don't have to do that. And I wouldn't like talking about that aspect with your customers. It's better to talk about the quality of the job, the choices that you will make creatively. That's something you want to be talking about, not about how many hours it costs to do a job. So I think that's another disadvantage. And also a disadvantage to me is when you're charging per hour, actually, it's in your own loss. It's your own loss if you work faster. So that's also a bit crazy idea. If you're very good and you do the job very fast, that's your own loss, because you will get less money just by doing it faster. So that's a bit of a strange idea. So I wouldn't recommend necessarily to work per hour. Sometimes it could be a combination. If you, for example, you use a fixed rate for a certain job, it costs 1,500 euros. And then you say, but if we have to do extra work, that extra work will be rated per hour. That could be interesting. That's another situation. But just full per hour pricing could be necessary, but it's not, for me, not the most interesting pricing model. Another revenue model could be per minute, which is even more extreme than per hour. It's just a fun example, not very easy, but there are examples like this website that charges really per minute. So you can call to experts for consultancy, and you really pay every minute you talk to them. So that's another example, just as an inspiration. Another very well-known revenue model is direct sales. So when you sell products, very often this is the way people work. So you give the product, you give the ownership of a product to your customer, and he gives the ownership of his money, of a part of his money to you. That's something that doesn't need a lot of explanation. Could be a good revenue model, of course, but there are alternatives. This is something interesting. When you deliver services as an entrepreneur, often people choose the rate per hour, or the rate per day is also an option. But it's possible to make services as products, to sell them as products. And this is an example of a jazz band that sell their shows. They give shows to for events, for example, and they don't sell a rate per hour. They say, okay, you can buy us as a package, our show as a package, and you can even make some choices which options you choose. For example, they say, okay, when you buy a jazz pack at our from our band, you can choose, I want one violin player, one singer, one trumpetist, or you can leave the trumpetist out, and every choice you make has an impact on the price. So they really made products of their service, and this could be, for a lot of service companies that are listening, an interesting choice, because it really takes you away from the hourly based rate, and it lets you think about product prices. And as I mentioned before, I think that could be interesting as a choice. When you do this, when you start productizing your services, you can also use a principle, and this is very interesting for all entrepreneurs. So if you don't know this, listen very carefully for a minute. You could use this principle of bracketing, and you probably know bracketing just by seeing this on your screen. It's used in software packages online very often. So often you have different choices, and the more you're willing to pay per month, for example, the more features you get. This is something that you could also use in totally different industries. So you could offer your customers different options for the same type of work, but with more or less options. And also, of course, then you offer different prices for each of the options. So, and that makes it very interesting for your customer too, because that activates some interesting thoughts with your customers. One thought is, okay, if you do it like this, if you offer several options for your customer, you actually create an offer for customers with different budgets. When you're starting to talk to a customer in the beginning, you don't know what his budget is. But if you do it like this, you could offer a cheaper version, which might be useful for customers with a low budget, and you also offer more expensive versions for the customers with higher budgets. Okay, that's interesting. But why is this also interesting? It triggers a different way of thinking. Instead of thinking, okay, here is my one option, it costs 5,000 euro. If you do it like that, the customer will say, okay, 5,000 euro, that's okay. Or the customer will say, that's way more than my budget, so no, I'm not going for it. Thank you a lot, but we're not going through with this. It's a yes or no question for the customer. But if you offer the customer 3 options, typically in bracketing, companies use 3 or 4 options. If you offer 3 or 4 options, the customer won't start thinking yes or no. The customer will start thinking, okay, I see 3 options. Which would be the most interesting for me? Is it option 1, option 2, or option 3? And by making that choice, he will already get attached to one of the choices unconsciously. And the chance of him choosing or being interested in one of the options is higher than when he only had that single option and it would have been a yes or no choice. So this is something really interesting that you could use in any industry. And what is an interesting thing that you could also do when you're using this bracketing principle is called anchoring. And anchoring is something that makes use of this principle, as you probably already figured out by now. The light blue balls, spheres, circles, the light blue circles are the same size on the left and on the right side. So they are just as big left and on the right. But just because of the surrounding circles, the one on the left seems much bigger. So that this principle can also be applied to pricing, and you will know it when you see this on your screen. You often see it in a restaurant menu. Supposing we can go to restaurants when Corona will be over. Often when you want to choose a bottle of wine in a restaurant, you will see there's one very expensive bottle of wine. And maybe you might think, who in the world would choose that bottle, because this is just too expensive compared to the rest of the prices, compared to the food. It's not logic to choose this expensive wine if you're in this restaurant. And maybe that's true. Maybe nobody buys that most expensive bottle, but just because that more expensive bottle is there, all the other prices seem cheaper. And that's the principle of anchoring. By adding one high price, people start to compare the other prices to that high price, and they will start thinking the other prices are cheaper. They make sort of a range of the cheapest and the highest price, and they're going to place all the other prices on the range, and they will, based on that, they will choose which is a good price for them. If the most expensive price wouldn't have been there, the range would have been smaller, and their spending choices would also be lower. So that's a principle that you could also apply in your own work. For example, if you sell jewelry, you could always make sure there's one expensive piece of jewelry on your web shop, even though if nobody wants to buy it, but if they see, oh, there's also jewelry of 900 euro for a ring, the one of 300 euro is really a good bargain. If the one of 900 wouldn't be there, the one of 300 might seem more expensive. So you get the idea, I think. If we go further and we look at some other revenue models, we come to a subscription model, which is also something that is more and more popular. This is a poet that sells his poems in a subscription model. So you buy a pin with a QR code, and you every day you can scan the QR code and you get one new poem, which is a good and original idea. You could use it in all types of industries, like this is art that you can buy in a subscription base digitally. In this case, you could choose for a rental revenue model, that you rent art, for example, that will be at the customer's place for 1 month, and then he changes it or he brings it back, which could be interesting. A retainer formula is often used in marketing agencies. In this revenue model, the customer pays a monthly fee, a fixed fee, and in exchange he gets a certain number of hours, and he pays this every month. And maybe if they're not, if the hours aren't all used, he can transpone them to the next month, which could be an interesting model because it gives you some certainty about your income for the coming months. This could be an interesting one. Royalties is often used in creative industries. In this revenue model, you actually pay for the right to use somebody else's rights. A designer designs furniture, for example. Another company like Xerox does this, produces the furniture and sells it. So they take care of all the other aspects, but they pay a certain royalty to the designer to compensate for his intellectual property rights. You could work with a percentage on budget. Architects often work like this. The whole project will cost a very large number of money, and then the architect takes a certain percentage, like 7 or 10%. This helps to put the the price in perspective to the whole price of the project, and it also makes it look more acceptable. So this could be interesting in some cases, also other cases than architecture. Pay per use, you pay what you use. Here's an example of a copyright company that works this way. A freemium model, we all know Zoom or other video chat applications these days, where you have a free offer with limited options, and if you want the more advanced options, you pay. Could work in other industries too, as a app builder, for example. Another model is the advertising model. We know it since very long from magazine and media, but we know it now also from influencers. So it's also an interesting model for some cases. Your customers, maybe the people who watch you as an influencer, are not the people that are paying, but the advertisers are the people who are paying, which could be interesting. Then a question that probably is a bit suggestive, that probably you might think of yourself that it's not the case. You don't have to ask the same price for everyone, and that's perfectly okay. Bracketing, we already talked about. It's okay to ask different prices for different options. Of course, that's a good example. But another example of different prices for the same product is licensing. If you use a licensing model, you could sell one picture to a newspaper and ask, for example, €200. But if you sell the same picture to a fashion label that will use the picture worldwide in all their marketing, of course, it's okay to ask much more for the same picture because it will be used very differently. So that's also an example of different prices for the same product. I'm going to move on a bit faster through some less important examples. This is also something nice. Pay what you want. Could also be a revenue model, not for your whole business probably because it's very uncertain, but it could be an interesting model. This is a photographer that uses it. This is a fashion brand, Wolk, from Antwerp. They used it very recently during the Corona crisis. They gave their customers the choice to choose if they wanted a discount code or not. So it's attractive. It's an interesting idea. It gives the power to your customers, and I think it's an interesting concept. Okay, I talked about a lot of revenue models. There are some more on the screen right now. I would suggest that you think about this also as a sort of a homework and how you could use some alternative revenue models in your own business. Maybe not for your full business, for everything you do, but just as an experiment, it could be interesting to think about different revenue models. It could be a way to stand out, and it could be a way to make more money, maybe. So that's something I would like to suggest. And then we are coming to the next part of the presentation, which is the pricing part, the methods, how to do your pricing. And I want to talk about 3 methods, which are, I think, very interesting. But first, I want to have a short look at the questions, if there are any. By now, I don't see any, so great. Then we can go further. What are those 3 pricing methods? So the first one is not rules of thumb. This is something we hear often. People think there are some types of eternal rules of thumb that work in their business. In fashion, I've heard them, for example, people that say, okay, you take your production cost, you multiply it by factor 2, and that should be your wholesale price, and then it should be this or that. That's not the thing. That's not the way I would suggest you to work. I don't say that those rules of thumb don't work. Sometimes they're approximately correct, but they leave a bit too much room for mistakes, for not being sure about how to to keep your business running. It depends a lot in a lot of circumstances. For example, if you have a very small business, the rule of thumb may not work. If you have a very big business, it may work. So it's a bit too dependent on the circumstances. I like to use 3 other methods. As I said before, the first one is the cost-based, the second one market-based, and the third the value-based pricing. When we come to the first one, then we talk about cost-based pricing. And in this method, I would advise you, it's a very important one, certainly for starters. If you are just starting as an entrepreneur, I would advise you to list all your costs that you make, both your variable and your fixed costs. Get a really good view on which costs you need to make when doing your work. A lot of people use this intuitively. It's a logic way to do pricing. And if you do this in a good way, I would use an Excel document, for example, or if you speak Dutch, which is very interesting right now, is you could use a tool that we developed, prijsinzicht.be, as you see on the screen. It's a way to enlist all your costs and to discover how the price that you ask and the sales variations that would follow from those prices, how those impact your revenue and your profits. This is just a screenshot of the website that you could use, but you could also do it in Excel, as I said. So how does it work? Actually, you have to think about all the costs you make. For example, okay, you need housing or you need a place to work. Okay, what will the costs be? You'll have some electricity costs. You'll need insurance. You will need internet, water. You will also have some overhead costs, like you need a bank, you need an accountant, maybe some software for your email. You have certain subscriptions. So you get the idea. You start thinking about all the costs that you make, transport, materials, marketing, not to forget your own salary. Of course, you also want to make some money by doing your work. So also there you should think about which amount do you want to earn. And in the tool that we made, prijsinzicht.be, the interesting thing is when you have unlisted all these costs, you could see, and then you actually only need to answer 2 more questions. First question is, okay, which is the price that you want to ask for this? And second, which is the amount of products that you think you will be able to sell? And when you complete those last 2 questions, the tool helps you by showing you what the result will be in your profit or in your loss, maybe. So and then the interesting thing is that you can play with both numbers. So if you then decide, okay, the first price I mentioned was 50 euros, but I'm going to make 60 of that, then you can see the impact on your hopefully profits. If you make it 40, if you lower your price to 40, then you can also see the impact. And the same goes for the amount that you sell. If you sell 10 of them every year, then you will see a certain profit. But if you make it 11, you will also see the impact on your profit and in your final revenue and results. And that's actually the way you need to look at your cost-based pricing. You want to see which prices do I need to ask as a minimum price, and that's actually the result of this pricing exercise. Which is the minimum price that you need to ask to make it break even, to not make losses in your work, and preferably to build up some reserves, to make some profits, so that you can, if there's a month that you don't sell a lot, that you still have something from the earlier months. So that's the thing you need to do when you're doing a cost-based pricing. You try to discover which is the minimum price that you need to ask to make your business model work. What is also very interesting when doing this exercise, so as I said, you can also do it in Excel if you're not Dutch speaking. It shows you the impact of discounts. If you have made the cost-based pricing exercise, you might notice, okay, let's just say your price is 100 euro. When you did the pricing exercise, cost-based, then you know that your costs are 90 of the 100 euro are covering your costs for the production, for your own salary, for everything that you need to pay for, and that 10 of the 100 euros are your profit, are the margin that you take. Okay, you know this is very interesting. But then also it's very clear that if you give a discount of 10%, which in some industries is something that people give without any thought, they say, okay, you're a B2B client, I will give you 10% discount. That will mean in this case that your full profit is going to zero. So you went from 100 to a price of 90. Okay, your costs are still covered, but you have zero profit. So your profit was lowered by 100%, which is a very big impact. So you really should think about, do I need to give a discount or do I not need to give a discount? It also works the other way around, which is the good side of this. If you would raise your price, if you would go from 100 to 101 euro, the impact would also be very nice then, because for the customer, it's a very small impact. It's only 1%. But for you, by just raising your price 1%, your profit will raise with 10%. Will go from 10 to 11, so that's 10% more profit that you keep in the end of the process. So that's the good side of this knowledge. It's something you should think about and also be very critical when you want to give discounts. The market-based pricing, I'm looking at the clock, and I already can predict that I will not stay in time. I'm very sorry for that. It was a bit difficult to estimate beforehand how much time we would take in this webinar. I would say I think I need about 20 more minutes, so I will probably go 15 minutes over time. I'm sorry for that. If you need to leave, I understand it completely, but you will receive the recording of the webinar afterwards. So just so you know, I think we could complete this in about 15 or 20 more minutes. So we're at the market-based pricing method. In this method, we are going to do pricing by comparing your price to the price of other competitors or other alternatives in the market. So this is also something a lot of people do intuitively. What is important to know if you're doing market-based pricing, if you're doing this research, you really want to compare apples with apples and not apples with pears. If you're a starter, don't try to compare your work with someone who is very experienced, who works in a total different league. Of course, you should try to compare your own work with something comparable. Sometimes, and certainly in the creative industry, that is difficult because creativity is something very subjective. It could be that people have total different ideas of the same work, so that's difficult in this case. And also you should know that your biggest competitor sometimes is not buying at all. So people won't compare your price to the price of your competitor. They will just think, do I really need this product? Yes or no? And therefore, the market-based pricing method is very relative. It's sometimes not that important, but sometimes it is important. It depends on how differentiating you are in your work, as I said in an earlier part of the webinar. How can you do this? I would not do it like this. This is some sentence I found on Google when Googling freelancer rates. You can read this as one of the first results in Dutch, that is. Don't just start looking at average rates because it's not okay. It's not how you can't compare to an average of all the freelancers worldwide or all the freelancers in Belgium. You need to look at the differentiating elements, of course. Often you also see very low rates, so I would most certainly not recommend to look at numbers like these. How can you research it? It's difficult. I know it is difficult. I don't have any lists of typical market prices because it also changes a lot. So I admit it's difficult to do this research, but some ways how to do it is by, for example, go to networking events with colleagues, try to talk to them. A lot of them are willing to be honest about their prices and will be willing to share them with you. So that's probably the most interesting way to do this research. You could also do some online research. Some people show their prices on their websites. You could ask your friends for maybe if they have proposals from competitors that they asked before, they could show them to you. You could learn a lot out of a written proposal, of course, also about how the competitor builds their prices. So that's something interesting, but not always easy. And sometimes you can find industry benchmarks. There are organizations that do surveys about pricing and that share those results. That's also, of course, interesting. If you start gathering prices of your competitors, as I said before, I think I would try to really write them down and make, for example, start an Excel. So you really have them on written down, so you really can compare them, not just in your head, but really in a specific mathematical way. What you could do is make a graph like this. If you could see, okay, I've discovered the price of, let's say, 20 competitors. You could make a graph and you could see, okay, the hourly rate of 5 of them is between this and this amount. 10 of them ask this rate. 2 of them ask this rate. That makes it interesting to get a view on how the market looks like. And these are just some examples of real graphs that I made in a former job of hourly rates. I don't want you to focus on the rates themselves, but I do want you to look at the way it is done, because it starts getting interesting here. If you see that there's a lot of difference between the prices of different competitors, you could start looking at the differences and the similarities with each of them. If you see that some of the competitors have really low prices, okay, try to investigate what are the differences compared to my work. Is my work better? Is it more creative? Do I have a better customer service? If that is the case, then it's probably okay to ask a higher rate than those competitors. You could do the same exercise with the most expensive competitors. If they're way better than you, okay, then there's probably a good reason why they're also way more expensive. That's the way I would look at market-based pricing. Then if we go to the third pricing method, we get to the value-based pricing, which is a very interesting one, because this one, I already mentioned it in the beginning, it's not taking into account the costs you make. It's not taking into account the market price that other competitors ask. It's really taking into account which value do you create for your customers. And this is probably the way that is the most future-proof way of pricing. That's why it's so interesting. It allows you to grow as an entrepreneur. It allows you to make some more money also. And therefore, I think it's interesting. Certainly in the creative industries, and I have this fun example, I think, because in the creative industry, it's a very important pricing method, for example, for artwork, like you see here. Sometimes you have huge differences in the pricing, but there's no correlation with the costs that are made to make it, or with the time that is invested to make it, or the market price. For example, on the left, you can see a work by the Dutch artist Piet Mondriaan. It was an early sketch of a painting he made later. I did some research. I saw it was sold in an auction for $2,000. Then on the right, you see a very similar drawing, which was made by my daughter, and which is priceless, obviously. But it's the same sort of paper. It's also made in pencil, but obviously there's a totally different price. So this is a good example why value-based pricing could be a totally different approach, which could be very interesting in the creative industries, because the value you create for someone can be so individual. Therefore, the price also should be very individual. The question, of course, is how to pinpoint that value. How do you know which is the value that you create for your customer? That's a difficult question. There are ways to do this. One way is not always possible, but sometimes you could calculate it. For example, if you're an SEO specialist if you do search engine optimization for your customers, which is also sort of a part of the creative industries, talking about copywriting and how to optimize websites. If you could calculate the impact of an SEO copywriting exercise, and you could see my SEO copywriting doubled the number of visitors to your website, you could also calculate, okay, that has this impact on your revenue because double the visitors to a web shop equals double the sales equals doubles the profit. Obviously, I'm telling it in a very easy way now, but you understand the idea. In sometimes it is possible to calculate which profits you can help make for your customers, or you could give a good estimate. If that's possible in your case, that's interesting. You could also look at it from the costs that you spare for your customer. For example, if the customer needs to write a text himself, then it would cost him a full day. You, as a copywriter, you could write the same text in a few hours. Maybe that's a spared cost for your customer. So that's also a way of determining which would be the value that you create or that you spare for your customer. That's one way of doing a value-based pricing exercise. Another way, which is in a way easier or is much better applicable in different situations, is doing a survey. So you could ask your customers, what is the value for you? What is the value that you would attribute to my product or to my service? It's interesting. This is a good way of doing a value-based pricing, but of course it's very dependent on the number of people you ask, on who you ask. So you have to do this, if you do a survey, you have to do this with the right people, the people who are really the customers that you are aiming for. So don't ask your sister or your friends and your family if they're not the people that you want to work for. Ask the questions to the people that are in your customer segments, that are in your target audience. A tip and a good method to do such a survey is not just by asking your customers, okay, how much would you pay? You could do that, but that's not very, the results will be very scattered, and you won't learn as much than if you do it in the way that you could see on the screen right now. This is a method developed in the 70s by Peter van Westendorp, a Dutch professor. And it's an interesting way of looking at it. He actually does surveys with 4 questions. So he asks 4 questions to all the people in the survey, and you can read them here. He actually describes the product or the service in a very good way, so it's really clear for the customer what they will get. And then he asks these 4 questions: what would be, and what price would you consider this product or this service so expensive that regardless of its quality, it is not worth buying? So in other words, which would you consider too expensive price? Which would you consider expensive but still worth it? So not a bargain, but you would still buy it. Third question, which would you consider inexpensive, and you have no doubt about the quality, so you would buy it actually immediately. You wouldn't even thought about it. It's just it is a bargain. It's not expensive. And the fourth question would be, what price would you consider so cheap, so inexpensive, actually too cheap, and at which price would you really think the quality can be good, which would be too cheap, and therefore when would you not buy it because it's too cheap? So if you ask those 4 questions, you get a better idea about the scale, about the range that people are willing to pay. You could also put these in graphs, that those graphs would look something like this, and then you get an idea. Often a good price is somewhere between the average of the second and the third question. So that's a bit the range of the acceptable prices that you're able to ask for your work. If we why value-based? I think I talked about this enough. It's what I would like to add is that value-based pricing, a good thing about it is it's not just a pricing method, it's also really a business philosophy, because if you want to please your customers And if you really focus on the value that you create for your customers, if you want them to answer a very high price when doing a survey, as I mentioned before, then you're going to focus on the value you create, and that's really a good business philosophy. You really want to think about, how can I create more value so they are willing to pay a higher price? That's a good business philosophy, and I would that's probably one of the main reasons why value-based pricing is so valuable. If you did the three exercises, if you did the cost-based, the market-based, and the value-based pricing method, you get, in theory, you get three prices. You get three numbers that are relevant for your product or your service. Maybe those three prices are similar, they're almost the same, but they could also be very different. It could be that the value-based pricing is much lower than the cost-based pricing, which would be a problem. Now, how do you choose the right price in your circumstances? I would say it depends on the positioning you want to choose, and also in the situation you're working in. If you're a starter, if you're just starting out, the chances are high that you really need to take in account the market-based price, because your work isn't that differentiating yet. Probably, there are always exceptions, but probably as a starter, you're not that differentiating yet. And also you need to take into account the costs you make. Certainly, when you're a starter, you really don't probably even know all the costs exactly. So then I would think, or I would reckon that the yellow dot on the screen is probably the area where you would be in your pricing choices. If you're in another situation, for example, when you're very experienced or you're very innovative, you make a very differentiating product, you're so creative that you make something that nobody else in the world could make, then it's, and there's also interest for your product, of course. People are willing to buy that very differentiating product. Then you could take the value-based pricing much more into account than the other pricing methods. So it really depends on how differentiating you are, and that's why in the beginning we took so many time to look at those differentiating aspects of your work. So depending on the choices you make, on the value you create, on how differentiating you are, you will see that one or the other pricing methods are more important for you than the others. As an example, well, I'm going to go through this because I think I have some more interesting last remarks to make. One is about how COVID-19, how Corona impacts pricing. This was a question that was sent to me before the webinar. Well, of course, COVID-19 is a huge impact. It's changing the way we work. The Guardian wrote very correctly, there's like 10 years of change happening in 1 week time. The whole industry is, a lot of industries are changing very fast. We're not sure if the impact will be very long term. Probably there will be a big long term impact, but on short term, it's huge. Obviously, everybody knows this. So what could be pricing ideas to cope with this impact? I have listed a few. So which could be pricing options to kickstart your sales revenue? How could you react to the crisis by using intelligent pricing? Obviously, pricing won't solve everything. That's certain, but it could help a bit. The first idea is not an easy one. It's one that may work, but it's not an easy one. I'm going to mention the ideas from the most interesting for you until the least interesting for you as an entrepreneur. So a price increase could be a way to, if you still have interest for your product, but you notice fewer people are interested, you could increase the prices. If you want to increase your prices now, but also later, a good idea is to increase it in small bits. So you can see it here. If you go from a price from 10 to 20, it's very easy to see that the price has made a high jump. If you go from 110 to 120, the difference is less noticeable. So it's always interesting to make smaller jumps when you're increasing your price than to do it only every few years, but then in bigger jumps, then it's less interesting to do this. What are other options to cope with the crisis? You could try to create more value. Maybe you could do some extra service, customer service, or deliver your work in other ways that are appropriate in these times, and in that way create more value and also make it more interesting to still become one of your clients. You could start differentiating your prices. We talked about bracketing. This could be an interesting moment to offer some options in your work and to also offer more cheaper versions of your work, so that if people don't have high budgets, they still can become a customer. It could be interesting. You could do promotions. This is less interesting for you, but it could be necessary. You could start giving temporary discounts. I'm not necessarily against it, but you always need to know, if you give a discount, how much can you give to prevent you from making losses, of course. And you could also give a price decrease, a permanent price decrease or a longer term decrease. So the difference with a promotion is that a promotion is really short term, like you say, now for this week I give a 10% discount. A price decrease is more permanent, that you say, okay, from now on I will be changing my price to this number. But also here, don't fool yourself. Keep into account what your costs are. Remember the cost-based pricing method. And also, if you give a discount, permanent or just as a promotion, I would always suggest to ask something in return, or to give something less in return, because if you don't do this, it will seem for your customers as if before you were asking just too much. You were making profits without a reason of them. So I would try to make it a good deal for everyone. For example, if you give a promotion, if you say, okay, the price drops with 10% for the following 2 weeks, you could ask, but then you need to pay upfront, or there's no customer, there's less customer service afterwards, or something else. But you could think of something that make it a more honest deal, actually, to give the promotion. What is also interesting is to keep into account Creative Fair Play. This is a website we launched a few years ago. It's not okay to ask to pay creatives unfair wages. And this is sort of a manifesto that you can always refer to when talking about prices. You can have a look. Do I want to say something else? Because as I said before, we're far out of time, so I don't want to miss on important tips. I'm just taking a look at my slides. Maybe. An interesting tip, I think. Something someone of you asked also. Sometimes you want to know the budget of your customers, and it's not always easy to let the customer tell the budget. It's sort of a game. Who mentions the first price? Is it you as a selling person, or is it the buyer? In some circumstances, it's difficult. I fully agree, and some customers don't want to tell what their budget is. That's a given. But it could be an idea if you want to know, if you want to have a bit of an idea of the budget your customer has. For example, when you're building websites, selling websites, or selling designs, you could ask, do you have a budget in mind? How much are you willing to pay for this job? The customer might say, I don't know, how much are you willing to ask? You could ping pong it right back to you. What you could do in that case is like say, well, I have different options, but I want to get a view on how big you see this this job. Is it, then this is the key aspect. You mentioned three numbers. For example, do you have a website in mind of like 500 euro or 5,000 euro or 50,000 euro? So you will notice those three numbers are very different: 500, 5,000, 50,000. Often, when you do it like that, the customer will always react. He will say, "Whoa, 50,000, never!" But 5,000, maybe somewhere around that. That could be my budget. Or he might say, "Well, actually, 500 was what I had in mind. So 5,000 or 50,000 is just crazy." Depending on his reaction, you will learn a lot. You will get an idea of, okay, is this a serious customer? Is he thinking he can get a website for 500? Then you know it's quick enough, and you know you won't probably will be willing to do business with him. But if he reacts okay to the 5,000, maybe you will learn a lot of that. So that's a way. It's just a tip how to ask this. I have a lot more to say, but I underestimated the time I would need. So I think we said the most important things. Of course, if there are some important questions that you still have, obviously you can ask them. Looking at Lisa a bit, who read the questions during the webinar. If there are any important questions, this is just a tip that I have. If you want to read some more, if you want to do some more research on pricing, these are two ebooks that I highly recommend. The one on the left is the most interesting for me, but it's also a pretty expensive book. The writer Blair Enns used value-based pricing to determine the price for his ebook, and it's therefore a pretty high price for an ebook. I think it's 200 euros for the cheapest ebook version, and if you want the printed version, it's like the printed version with additional videos and all other options. So he also used bracketing. It's 500 euros, so it's a pretty expensive book, but it's very interesting. If you don't want to pay it, you can also listen to his podcast. You can find it when you Google Two Bob's podcast. Then you will find it. There's also a lot of good tips in there. And another ebook which is much cheaper is called Pricing Design. I think it's about 8 or 10 euros. So that's also an interesting one if you want some inspiration or more information how I gained my knowledge on pricing. Okay, I'm waiting for Lisa. Lisa, did you read any questions?
Not that many at the moment. So if anyone still has a question, you can always drop it in the question box.
Okay.
There was one person, Esther, who asked if the cost-based pricing exercise would also be relative to unique pieces like art. Maybe the value-based pricing is more relevant for her. For art.
Absolutely, yeah. That's why I showed the Mondrian picture when I was talking about value-based pricing. When making art, the cost-based pricing method is not very relevant. Obviously, you need to know your minimum cost that you need to cover. So it's always important to do a cost-based exercise just to know the minimum price you need to ask. But when you're making art, the value-based price will be much more important. And that works in both ways. If you're making really bad art, or maybe I should say art that not many people like, that also says a lot about the value and also will have a huge impact on the price you're able to ask. If you're making really nice art that a lot of people would like, then you could obviously create more value, and the value-based pricing will allow you to ask a much higher price than when you would just look at it in a cost-based way. Yeah.
Okay, there are two more questions, Simon. We have one From someone who is asking, we often see a client strategy that avoids a pricing discussion. For example, the client says we have 100k euros, give us your best offer or services. From then on, the negotiation is about the services offered and not on pricing. The client will push for the maximum offer, but the budget stays the same. How to deal with this?
I'm just reading the question once more because it was pretty long.
Yeah.
It's a smart client, of course. Well, you don't have to enter that discussion if you don't want, because you could, for example, you could answer this question with a bracketing pricing offer. Like you say, okay, you have 100,000 as a budget. Our product is, we have 3 versions of what we want to make for you. We have an option of 100,000, but we also have an option of 120,000. It's higher than your budget, but you should know if you take that option, these are the additional options that you will get. This is the extra value that you will receive. So you could sort of force him into the way of working that you want to use. And yeah, more important, I think you just don't need to. I think you should be just honest and fair with the client. If the budget is 100,000, then you could include a certain amount of services that you're willing to give. But it's not because the client doesn't want to raise his price higher than 100,000 that you need to follow in just pushing in more and more services. It's your decision as an entrepreneur what is included in 100,000 or what isn't. Yeah, I think that would be my answer to that. And I also see the other question of Laurent, how to do a survey for value-based pricing. Well, the questions that you could use, I mentioned, but really when you mean in a really practical way, you could do it via the internet. You could make a form, a Google form or whatever type of form, and send it out to a lot of people, which is easy because your results will also be very structured. You get an Excel with all the results very nicely listed, but also has disadvantages because you don't have an exact view on who the people are that will be completing the form. You're not sure that they understood everything well. So if you want to do a very qualitative survey, I would recommend to do it face-to-face. I would recommend to talk with the customers that you have in mind and do the questionnaire face-to-face. So you see their reaction, you see if they understand what you're talking about, and then you could get some more valuable feedback than when you do it online. But they both have pros and cons, of course, because when you do it online, you could ask much more customers, and it's much easier to reach people online than when you really need to have them in front of you. So it's obviously also interesting to do a combination of both. I would say if there are any other questions, I'm very happy to answer them. You could email me at, as you can see on the screen now, advies@flandersdc.be, or you could, if you want to reach me personal, you could also send an email to simon@flandersdc.be. I'm happy to answer them. But I think we have to end the webinar almost because we have the next one that will start right about now. So I suggest that we end the webinar now. I thank you very, very much for being present during the webinar and for the questions and the answers given. As I said, if you have any more questions, feel free to contact me via email, and then hopefully till next time. Thank you very much.